The Dark Scrolls. They said she was born to change the fate of crowns, though she herself never wore one. In the spring of 1515, in a Scotland still trembling from bloodshed, a child was laid in her mother's arms, and with her first cry the future of two kingdoms bent in a new direction. Her name was Margaret Douglas, and from the moment she existed, she was both treasure and threat. To some, she was the key to peace between England and Scotland. To others, she was the spark that could reignite war. She carried the blood of the Tudors through her mother, Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, and the fierce blood of the Douglas clan through her father, Archibald, Earl of Angus. She would grow to be remembered as the woman between two thrones, and her story began in an atmosphere already thick with betrayal and ambition. Her mother's life was a tragedy of power. Margaret Tudor, once a glittering princess of England, had been given as a bride to James IV of Scotland. It was a marriage meant to bind two hosts, isle nations with a chain of kinship. She had crossed the border as a girl, adorned in silks, carrying the hopes of her father Henry VII and her brother Henry VIII. For a time, she was adored in Scotland, giving birth to heirs and cementing the alliance. But the bond of peace broke as quickly as it was forged. In 1513, James IV was slain at the Battle of Flodden, cut down on English soil, leaving his kingdom in the hands of a widow and a baby son. The Queen Dowager was only in her early 20s, suddenly surrounded by ambitious men who saw in her weakness an opportunity to grasp power. It was in these shadows that Margaret Douglas's future was cast. Margaret Tudor remarried swiftly, choosing Archibald Douglas, the powerful Earl of Angus, to protect her. But marriage to Angus brought her no safety. The Scottish nobles despised his influence, and within months suspicion poisoned their union. They accused him of overreaching, of seizing too much control over the young king, James V. Once proud Queen Mother and her new husband were dragged into bitter factional disputes. Scotland itself became a battlefield of wills, and, in the middle of this storm, a small child, Margaret Douglas, was born into a world where family was synonymous with treachery. From her earliest memories, she must have sensed that her life was not her own. Her father clashed violently with her mother. Her half-brother, James V, was a king in name, but a prisoner in practice, and she herself was the daughter of two bloodlines at war. The Douglas family sought to dominate the Scottish crown. The Tudor family in England eyed the Northern Kingdom with suspicion. Where could a girl like her belong? She was never free of danger, never free of scrutiny. Every breath she took was watched by men who wondered how her existence might serve them. By the time she was sent to England, her childhood had already been shaped by conflict. She was placed in the household of Henry VIII, not as an ordinary niece, but as a living pledge of loyalty. For the king, keeping her close was both a strategy and a warning. As long as she was under his gaze, her marriage could be arranged according to his will, her alliances monitored, her every smile and gesture weighed against the future of his dynasty. Margaret Douglas grew up in palaces that glittered with music and jewels, yet the walls that enclosed her were stronger than stone. She was a prisoner dressed in velvet, bound by her own bloodline. At the English court, she quickly became known for her grace and beauty. Chroniclers noted the light in her face, the brightness of her eyes, the air of distinction she carried. But beauty at the Tudor court was never harmless. It drew attention, It provoked whispers, and it made her a figure of interest in a place where ambition was a constant plague. She was cousin to Princess Mary, later Queen Mary I, and a companion to Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn. She shared their lessons in languages, music, and scripture. She laughed beside them at masques and revels, and she knelt beside them in solemn prayer. Yet, unlike them, she had no secure place. She was neither acknowledged as an heir nor dismissed as insignificant. She was dangerous, precisely because she might be something more. The atmosphere of Henry's court was intoxicating and deadly. A girl in her teens could watch queens crowned and queens destroyed in the space of a year. Catherine of Aragon's long reign ended in disgrace. Anne Boleyn ascended in triumph and was cut down on the scaffold. Jane Seymour gave the king the son he longed for and died within days. Anne of Cleves was ridiculed and discarded. Catherine Howard, no older than Margaret herself, was seduced, betrayed, and executed. And Catherine Parr survived by the sharpness of her wit. To live in this world was to live in a theatre where every smile could mask a dagger. For Margaret Douglas, the lesson was brutal and unforgettable. Women of royal blood were tools. And tools were used until they broke, but she was not merely an observer. She was a young woman with a heart, and hearts in the Tudor world were dangerous. She fell in love, recklessly, fatally, with Thomas Howard, the handsome younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk. He was gallant, ambitious, and from one of the most powerful families in England. To two young souls surrounded by suspicion and calculation, the attraction must have been irresistible. They dreamed of marriage, whispered vows of devotion, planned a future where their love could triumph over the cold machinery of politics. But Henry VIII discovered the secret, and his rage was swift and merciless. For the king, such a union was not romantic. It was treasonous. If Margaret Douglas married without his permission, she might bear children who could lay claim to the throne. The Howard family was already too powerful, and he would not allow them to strengthen themselves with Tudor blood. The lovers were arrested, dragged to the Tower of London, their hopes smashed upon the cold stones of the fortress. Margaret lay in her cell, her future in ruins, while Thomas Howard wasted away until death claimed him. She survived, but the scars remained. She had learned that love, in her world, was fatal. Her beauty had made her desirable, but her bloodline had made her dangerous. Every man who looked at her saw not only a woman, but also a claim to power. And every time she allowed herself to hope, the crown crushed her under its weight. Still, she endured. Henry VIII forgave her in time, for his forgiveness was as fickle as his anger. She returned to court, cautious, subdued, but never broken. Yet the memory of Thomas Howard lingered, the echo of what she had lost, haunting her every step. And as she watched Henry's children grow, as she saw Mary, Elizabeth, and the young Edward shift in and out of favor, she must have wondered what destiny her own blood would carve for her. She had no crown, no throne, but she possessed a heritage that could not be ignored. The question was not whether she would be drawn into the struggles of her age. It was only how deeply and at what cost. In these years of youth, her life foreshadowed all that was to come. Love entangled with ambition, survival balanced against danger, family ties poisoned, by suspicion. She was a Tudor by birth and a Douglas by inheritance, a creature of two worlds, never fully embraced by either. England held her as a jewel too precious to let go. Scotland remembered her as the daughter of a queen who had abandoned them, and she herself walked the thin line between belonging and exile. She could not choose her fate. Her fate had chosen her from the day she was born. If you close your eyes, you can see her, a young woman in velvet and pearls, standing in the shadow of Henry VIII's throne, her face calm, her heart uncertain. The music of the court drifts around her, lutes and viols weaving their melodies, but beneath the harmony lies the steady beat of fear. For she knows what others do not yet see, that her story will not end in the glitter of banquets or the laughter of masks. Her story is one of survival, of ambition disguised as obedience, of a woman who, without ever wearing a crown, would give birth to kings. Love at the Tudor court was never innocent. For Margaret, it had already proved fatal once, leaving her with a broken heart and a name tarnished by suspicion. Yet she was young, beautiful, and still full of longing, and the court was a place where eyes met across crowded chambers, where letters passed in secret, and where whispers could bind or destroy lives. To survive, she needed to be cautious. To be human, she could not always resist, and in that tension, her fate was sealed again and again. After her release from the Tower, she carried herself with greater care. Henry VIII had restored her to favour, though favour in his court was never secure. He saw her usefulness. She was unmarried, of noble blood, a niece who could be deployed to strengthen alliances. Yet he also saw the danger of her independence. She had already risked everything for Thomas Howard, and he did not trust her to submit without protest. Margaret learned to move softly, to smile when required, to mask her feelings behind courtesy. But desire has a way of breaking through even the thickest mask. In the years that followed, she attracted more admirers, and once again, her heart betrayed her. She was rumored to have fallen into dangerous entanglements with courtiers whose ambitions matched her own. One of them was Charles Howard, a kinsman of the very family that had already brought her to ruin. The Howards were relentless, forever hovering near the throne, forever seeking to strengthen their claim by weaving themselves into the Tudor web. To Henry VIII, every such connection reeked of conspiracy. For Margaret, it was once more a reminder that the men who loved her did not only see her face, they saw her blood. And Henry's suspicion did not soften with age. As his marriages failed, as his temper grew more violent, his paranoia deepened. To him, even the faintest rumor of a match involving Margaret Douglas was intolerable. More than once, she was arrested again, questioned, and imprisoned for little more than the suggestion that she might have promised her heart to the wrong man. Imagine the terror of being seized without warning, carried once more to the Tower, her rooms stripped of their warmth, her body confined within walls that had already claimed the lives of so many others. The cold stones remembered Anne Boleyn's prayers, Thomas More's final words, and the silent footsteps of countless doomed souls. To Margaret, those stones also remembered her own grief, the days she had once endured as a prisoner for daring to love. Each time, she managed to survive. The king's wrath passed like a storm, and she was released, weary but not destroyed. Yet every imprisonment carved deeper scars into her life. Her reputation grew shadowed, her name whispered in the corridors as though she were cursed. But she was not cursed. She was simply a woman born into a family where love itself was treason. Even so, she endured with a resilience that astonished those who knew her. She learned to play by the game more carefully, to cloak her ambition in modesty, to endure suspicion with a quiet dignity. And as the years passed, she began to see that survival might demand more than discretion. It might require alliance. If she could no longer follow her heart, perhaps she could follow her mind. And so she married, not for love, but for power, binding herself to Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, a man whose loyalty to England made him useful to Henry, and whose Scottish blood made him a bridge between two realms. In their union, Margaret found not passion, but strategy. And in strategy she found the promise of something greater, the hope that her children might succeed where she herself had been thwarted. With Matthew Stuart, she began the role that would define her life, not merely a noble woman at court, but a mother whose ambition for her sons would rival that of any king. She gave birth to several children, though, as in so many Tudor stories, grief walked hand in hand with joy. Some of her babies died in infancy, their tiny lives extinguished before they could breathe fully of the world. Others survived to grow into young men, whose fates would carry her hopes forward. And above all, one son would come to embody her dreams, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. From the moment of his birth, Margaret saw in him not only a child, but a weapon. His blood was rich with claim, Stuart from his father, Tudor from his mother. He was nephew to kings, cousin to queens, and in his veins flowed the lineage of two crowns. She nurtured him with ambition as much as with love, whispering into his cradle the destiny she believed awaited him. For Margaret had learned through her own suffering that the path to power lay not in her own hands, but in those of her children. What she had been denied, her son might one day seize. But ambition for her children did not shield her from danger. Elizabeth I, who rose to the throne after the death of her half-siblings Edward VI and Mary I, watched Margaret with a wary eye. Elizabeth was sharp, cautious, and deeply protective of her crown. She knew well that Margaret's blood made her a potential rival. In an age where succession was uncertain, where Elizabeth refused to marry and produced no heir, every cousin of Tudor descent became a shadow at her shoulder. And Margaret Douglas, with her beauty, her pride, and her fertile children, was a shadow Elizabeth could never quite banish. Time and again Elizabeth ordered her imprisoned. Sometimes it was for schemes Margaret had encouraged, marriage negotiations, whispered plans to promote her son. Sometimes it was merely for suspicion, for the gossip of alliances that Elizabeth feared might one day erupt into rebellion. For Margaret, the cycle repeated endlessly. A few years of freedom at court, then sudden arrest, months of captivity, slow release. It was as though her life were a wheel turning round and round, spinning between favor and disgrace. And yet she clung fiercely to her purpose, refusing to let prison walls extinguish her hope. It is impossible not to wonder how she endured. Each imprisonment stripped her of dignity, yet she emerged again and again, still determined, still plotting. Did she sit in her cell at night, remembering the dead Thomas Howard, the lover who had perished for her, and ask whether it had all been worth it? Did she look at the faces of her sons, growing taller with each passing year, and tell herself that every humiliation, every suspicion, every cold night in the tower was nothing compared to the possibility that one day they might sit upon a throne? Whatever she felt, she never gave up. She understood that in her world, the only victory for a woman of royal blood was to secure a crown for her descendants. And so the dangerous affairs of her youth, the love that had once destroyed her, became the foundation for something harder, colder, more unyielding. She had learned that the heart could not be trusted, but the will could. She had suffered for passion, but she would endure for ambition. No longer merely a pawn of kings, Margaret Douglas transformed herself into a player in her own right. She maneuvered carefully, endured suspicion, and nurtured her children as weapons in the endless war for power. And though her enemies thought they had defeated her with every imprisonment, she knew better. Each survival was a victory, each scar was a lesson, and each child was a promise. Her greatest gamble was not with her own life, but with the life of her son. From the moment Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, took his first breath, Margaret understood that the boy was her answer to every wound, every humiliation, every chain that had ever bound her. What she herself had been denied, he might claim. Where her own heart had been broken, his might conquer. In him, she saw the living bridge between two realms, the chance to bind England and Scotland together under one crown. The court might whisper, Elizabeth might imprison her, enemies might scorn her name, but Margaret clung to her son with a ferocity that frightened even her friends. He was more than flesh of her flesh. He was destiny in human form. She raised him with the devotion of a woman who had suffered too much to be careless. Darnley grew tall, strikingly handsome, with the golden hair and pale complexion that seemed almost crafted to win hearts at court. He learned the languages of kings, practiced the dance of diplomacy, mastered the arts that might one day make him a consort or even a monarch. Yet beneath the polish of his education, he inherited something dangerous too. The arrogance of the Douglas line, the vanity of youth fed on endless praise, the hunger for power that his mother whispered into his ear like a lullaby. Margaret, blinded by love and ambition, failed to see that in feeding him dreams of crowns, she had also fed him a thirst for dominance that would destroy him. The stage upon which her son would rise was already prepared. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had returned from France a widow, beautiful and young, and she carried her own claim to the throne of England. To Margaret, it was as though fate had carved out a path just for her. If her son could marry Mary, then their union would weave together two strands of royal blood. Mary as the reigning Queen of Scotland, Darnley as a descendant of Henry VII. Their children, if God granted them, would inherit both claims. And with Elizabeth of England refusing to marry and bearing no heirs, who could doubt that the future belonged to them? In Margaret's eyes, it was inevitable. Her son would sit beside a queen, and her grandchild would wear the crowns of both realms. But inevitability in Tudor and Stuart courts was always a dangerous illusion. Margaret's plotting did not go unnoticed. Elizabeth watched with growing suspicion, for she knew that a marriage between Mary and Darnley would create a threat more powerful than any foreign army. A queen with Tudor blood, married to a man whose claim rivaled Elizabeth's own, that was a storm the English crown could not contain. And so Elizabeth attempted to stall, to obstruct, to forbid. But she underestimated the will of a mother who had already endured prisons, losses, and betrayals. Margaret pushed forward, maneuvering in secret, whispering encouragement, nudging events, until the two young royals could meet. When Mary and Darnley finally encountered one another, the spark was immediate, though it burned with a reckless fire. Mary saw in him a cousin of noble birth, handsome, gallant, with a claim that mirrored her own. He seemed the perfect partner, English by blood, Scottish by ambition, and a man whose presence could strengthen her cause. Darnley, intoxicated by Mary's beauty and the idea of being consort to a queen, fell headlong into the role his mother had imagined for him since infancy. They were married in 1565, and Margaret, hearing the news, must have felt her heart swell with triumph. At last, her years of endurance had borne fruit. Her son was husband to a queen. Her grandchild, when born, would unite the thrones of England and Scotland. For one brief moment, the dream she had clung to so fiercely seemed to come alive. Yet dreams that come too easily often curdle into nightmares. The marriage, celebrated with music, feasts, and proclamations, quickly rotted beneath the weight of Darnley's arrogance. Margaret had taught him to believe in himself, destiny, but she had not taught him humility. He demanded to be crowned king in his own right, not merely consort. He schemed for power, drank too deeply, and flaunted his charms with other women, humiliating the wife who had raised him to such heights. Mary, accustomed to ruling and proud in her own strength, grew resentful of his demands. Their union, which Margaret had believed would seal two kingdoms in harmony, became instead a battlefield of pride and betrayal. The worst came when Darnley entangled himself in one of the darkest crimes of Mary's reign, the murder of David Rizzio, her secretary and closest confidant. In a storm of jealousy and manipulation, Darnley conspired with lords who despised Rizzio's influence. One evening, as Mary dined with her ladies, armed men burst into her chambers, dragged Rizzio before her eyes, and stabbed him over 50 times while she, pregnant with child, was held helpless. It was an act that stained Darnley forever in history, and one that shattered Mary's trust. She had been willing to forgive his vanity, to overlook his indulgences, but she could not forgive the blood spilled in her own chamber at his command. Margaret, hearing of these events, must have felt the icy dread of dreams collapsing. This was not the glorious union she had imagined. This was chaos, scandal, and the shadow of ruin. Yet even as her son stumbled into disgrace, she could not abandon him. He was still her creation, her hope, her bridge to power. She excused, she defended, she prayed. But fate, once set in motion, has little patience for denial. In 1567, Darnley was murdered in one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in Scottish history. His body was found in the garden of a house in Edinburgh, strangled after a mysterious explosion that had reduced the building to rubble. Suspicion fell on many, on the lords who hated him, on Mary herself who had come to despise him, on Bothwell, the man she would soon marry. To Margaret, the details mattered less than the devastation. Her son, the bright star of her ambition, was gone. The boy she had nurtured, the man she had groomed, lay cold in the earth. His brief and disastrous reign as Queen's consort ended in betrayal and fire. Yet even in her grief, Margaret's mind turned to the future. Darnley was dead, but his union with Mary had produced a child, James, a small, fragile infant, but one who carried in his veins the blood of both Tudor and Stuart, both England and Scotland. In that child, Margaret's dream lived on. If she could no longer shape her son's destiny, she would devote herself to the destiny of her grandson. And in that resolve, she proved the resilience that had marked her all her life. Prison could not break her, scandal could not silence her, and even death could not rob her of ambition. She would raise her eyes to the future and see in that child the crown she had always imagined. The tragedy of Margaret Douglas is that her love for her children was inseparable from her hunger for power. She adored Darnley, but she also demanded of him a greatness he could not sustain. She mourned his loss, but she also clung to the hope that his son would redeem him. Her motherhood was not gentle, it was political, sharpened by years of humiliation and strengthened by iron will. In that, she was both victim and architect of her own story. She had taught her son to dream of thrones, and those dreams had destroyed him. Yet she could not, would not let go. Even as Elizabeth's spies watched her, even as suspicion closed around her like a noose, Margaret carried on. She plotted, she whispered, she endured fresh imprisonments, all for the sake of the child who might one day claim both crowns. Her life had been a series of storms, but in her grandson James she glimpsed the calm that might follow. She would not live to see it, but she believed in it with a faith as unyielding as stone. The night her son was lowered into the earth, Margaret must have felt as though the very walls of her world had collapsed. All her sacrifices, all her careful schemes, every moment of survival had been poured into Darnley, and now he was gone, snuffed out, not on a battlefield with honor, but in a garden with treachery. For days, perhaps weeks, she lingered in grief, haunted by visions of his youth, the boy she had once cradled, the man she had imagined crowned beside a queen. Yet grief in the Tudor world was never private, and Margaret had no luxury to mourn without purpose. She was a woman whose bloodline tied two thrones together, and her enemies knew it as well as she did. Even as tears stained her cheeks, she fixed her eyes on the child her son had left behind. James was only a babe, too small to know the storms that swirled around him, but to Margaret, he was already the vessel of salvation. If the father had failed, perhaps the son could succeed. The scandal of Darnley's murder did not fade, but instead ignited a blaze that consumed Mary, Queen of Scots. Whispers grew into accusations, accusations into trials of opinion, until Mary's marriage to Bothwell, the man widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's death, confirmed the worst fears of her people. In the streets of Edinburgh, angry voices rose against her. Lords who once bowed to her now marched in rebellion. Within months, Mary was forced to abdicate her throne, leaving her infant son James as king under the regency of Scottish nobles. Mary fled to England, seeking refuge with Elizabeth, but refuge soon turned into captivity. For nearly 2 decades, she would languish under guard, a queen in name but a prisoner in truth. And through it all, Margaret Douglas watched with the unblinking eyes of a mother and grandmother who had learned that thrones were made not of gold but of blood and survival. From her vantage point in England, Margaret saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. Mary was disgraced, imprisoned, won, her power broken. But her child lived, and that child was Margaret's grandson. James VI of Scotland, a boy of fragile health and bright eyes, carried within him the union of Tudor and Stuart blood. He was the heir, not only to Scotland, but, in Margaret's vision, to England itself. Elizabeth was childless, her refusal to marry leaving the future of the Tudor line uncertain. What greater solution than James, the boy who embodied both realms? Margaret nurtured this vision with a fervor that bordered on obsession. She had lost her son, but she would not lose the future. Every letter, every whispered conversation, every alliance she sought was bent toward the singular purpose of raising James to the destiny she believed was his birthright. But Elizabeth was not blind. The Queen of England, clever and cautious, saw in Margaret not the grieving mother she appeared to be, but the dangerous matriarch of a rival dynasty. Margaret had already been imprisoned multiple times under suspicion of plotting marriages and alliances without permission. Now, with Mary Stuart in England and her son James proclaimed king in Scotland, Margaret's influence became even more threatening. Once more she was seized, once more her chambers were searched, once more she found herself behind the bars of the Tower. It was a cruel pattern she had come to know too well. Freedom for a season, then suspicion, arrest, confinement. Yet she bore it with a grim endurance, always keeping her mind fixed on the image of her grandson ascending to the English throne. If she had to rot in prison for that vision, then so be it. What must it have been like, in those years, to live under constant watch? Imagine her walking the narrow corridors of her confinement, her gown brushing the cold stone, her thoughts heavy with the knowledge that at any moment Elizabeth's anger could turn fatal. She had seen what became of those who threatened the crown. Anne Boleyn's head struck off, Thomas Howard dead in his cell, Noble lay disgraced and forgotten. She knew that her own bloodline made her a perpetual suspect, and yet she endured, whispering prayers in the night, reminding herself that she was not merely a prisoner, but a grandmother to a king. Others might see her as a woman broken by loss, but within her burned a quiet fire that not even Elizabeth's iron will could extinguish. The years stretched on, and news from Scotland filtered slowly into her confinement. James was growing, tutored by Protestant lords who molded him to their vision of a godly king. He was clever, precocious, already showing the sharp mind and quick tongue that would one day charm and irritate in equal measure. Margaret longed to see him, to guide him herself, but distance and politics kept them apart. Still, she believed in him fiercely. He was her redemption, the proof that her suffering had not been in vain. If Darnley's arrogance had ruined him, perhaps James's intellect would save him. If her own heart had been punished for love, perhaps his reign would heal the breach between England and Scotland. To Margaret, he was not just a child. He was the culmination of everything she had endured. Yet she also knew the danger he faced. In Scotland, factions tore at one another, each seeking to control the young king. Regents rose and fell, murdered or overthrown, while James was shuffled like a prize from one guardian to another. Every shift in power could mean disaster for him, and every disaster for him was a dagger in Margaret's heart. She prayed that the blood of both Tudors and Douglases would give him the strength to withstand such storms. But she also knew that ambition could destroy as easily as it could elevate. She had seen it in her son. She had lived it herself. And so her prayers were not only for his triumph, but for his survival. In England, meanwhile, her own position remained precarious. Elizabeth, though wary, sometimes showed her flashes of favor, allowing her moments of comfort, visits to court, glimpses of life beyond the Tower. But it was always conditional, always shadowed by suspicion. One false step, one careless word, and Margaret would find herself imprisoned again. She learned to guard her speech, to cloak her ambitions in silence, to appear as nothing more than a grieving mother. But beneath the silence, she continued to weave her web, cultivating allies who shared her belief that James was the true solution to the succession crisis. Her final years were a mixture of hope and exhaustion. She had lost so much: her youth, her loves, her son. And yet she had gained the certainty that her bloodline would endure. In 1578, death finally claimed her, and she was laid to rest at Westminster Abbey, her tomb a quiet monument among kings and queens. She did not live to see the fulfillment of her dream, but she left the world believing in it, and history would prove her right. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, it was James VI of Scotland, her grandson, who crossed the border to become James I of England, uniting the crowns at last. The vision Margaret had carried like a flame through years of suffering came true, though she was no longer there to see it. If we look back at her life, we see not only the tragedies that befell her, but the remarkable endurance she embodied. She was born into conflict, raised as a political hostage, punished for love, and scarred by loss. She was imprisoned more times than most men survived, accused, threatened, and scorned. And yet through it all she held fast to the belief that her family would prevail. She never wore a crown, but she was the grandmother of a king who ruled 2 nations. She never commanded armies, but her bloodline shaped the course of history. She was, in truth, the woman between 2 thrones, bridging England and Scotland. Her life a testament to the power of persistence, and her legacy, the union of the crowns. Her story is a reminder that history is not only written by those who wear crowns, but also by those who don't. Who shape the people who inherit them. Margaret Douglas, with her defiance, her ambition, and her maternal ferocity, shaped the destiny of Britain as surely as any king. Her life was a crucible of love and power, and though it ended before her dream was fulfilled, her grandson's coronation was her final triumph. And so she lingers in history, a figure of shadows and endurance, her voice whispering across the centuries. That survival itself can be a victory, and that sometimes the most powerful crown is the one imagined and secured not for oneself, but for one's blood. She did not live to see the crown placed upon her grandson's head, but her shadow was present in that moment, as surely as if she had been standing in Westminster herself. When Margaret Douglas breathed her last in 1578, she left behind no throne, no army, no direct dominion. What she left instead was blood, and in that blood the power to unite kingdoms. Her body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, a final irony for a woman so often imprisoned, so often distrusted, so often accused of treason. There she lies among kings and queens, a silent acknowledgement that her place in the great drama of dynasties could not be denied. And though her tomb grew quiet, her legacy was only just beginning to speak. Elizabeth I still reigned, sharp of mind and relentless in her caution, but her reign was not eternal. As the years slipped by, the question that had haunted England since her youth became louder. Who would inherit her throne? She had no children, no husband, no heir of her body. Her counsels, laws whispered of foreign princes, of distant cousins, of noblemen who might step forward to stake a claim. Yet in every debate, every anxious conversation, The same name hovered like a spectre above them all. James, the son of Mary Stuart and Henry Darnley, the grandson of Margaret Douglas. He was young, he was clever, and above all, he was the embodiment of what Margaret had dreamed. His very existence proved her right, that the crown would pass not by Elizabeth's design, but by the persistence of bloodlines too strong to ignore. James's childhood in Scotland had been precarious, marked by plots and shifting regencies. He was pulled between factions like a pawn, threatened by assassination, held captive by nobles who sought to control him. And yet, he survived. He learned to balance his words, to play men against one another, to wield his intellect as both shield and weapon. By the time he reached manhood, he had grown into a king of unusual wit and cunning, more scholar than soldier, but no less dangerous for it. He carried himself with the assurance of one who knew his destiny was greater than the hills and castles of Scotland. He believed, as his grandmother had believed, that England awaited him. Margaret would have recognized herself in him, perhaps even more than she had in her son. Where Darnley had been reckless and vain, James was deliberate and calculating. Where Darnley had destroyed himself with arrogance, James cloaked his pride in reason and strategy. He had inherited his grandmother's resilience, her refusal to yield to circumstance, her ability to turn survival itself into triumph. And when Elizabeth finally lay dying in 1603, the kingdom turned its gaze northward. James was proclaimed King of England, and for the first time the crowns of England and Scotland rested on a single head. The union of the crowns had come to pass, not by treaty, not by conquest, but by the bloodline that Margaret Douglas had so fiercely preserved. On that day of triumph, when heralds cried out his new titles and church bells thundered across London, the memory of Margaret could not be erased. She had been the woman between two thrones, scorned and suspected in her lifetime, yet vindicated in death. Though she never wore a crown, she was the grandmother of the monarch who united two nations. Though she had been a prisoner, her bloodline brought freedom to kingdoms long divided by war. In her grandson's coronation, her life found its purpose. She had not lived in vain. And yet, her story is not only one of triumph, but also of the hidden cost of ambition. She had sacrificed peace for strategy, love for survival, her son for her vision. Darnley's life had been shattered by the weight of her expectations, his marriage poisoned by the ambition she had instilled in him. Mary Stuart's downfall had been accelerated by the disastrous union Margaret had so ardently pursued. Even James's childhood was marked by the scars of a kingdom torn apart, a kingdom that would. Will never fully forgive his mother or his father. The legacy Margaret left was both glorious and tragic, a tapestry woven of both light and shadow. But perhaps that is why her story endures. In her we see not a saint or a villain, but a woman caught in the relentless machinery of Tudor and Stuart politics, a woman who endured imprisonment, scandal, and grief, yet refused to surrender her will. She was both victim and architect, both pawn and player, and in that tension lies her humanity. She reminds us that history is not made only by those who wear crowns, but also by those who bear them in their hearts, who suffer in silence, who gamble everything for a dream they may never see fulfilled. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren would rule not only England and Scotland, but also Ireland, and eventually a vast empire across the seas. The Stuart dynasty, for all its later turmoil, owed its English throne to Margaret's persistence. Without her, James might have been dismissed as a foreign, unworthy of England's allegiance. With her, he was the heir of Tudor blood, the rightful successor in the eyes of those who valued lineage above all else. Margaret had planted the seed, and history reaped the harvest. Imagine, then, if her spirit could have lingered, unseen, in Westminster Abbey on the day James entered London. The crowd surged to greet him, tossing caps into the air, crying out with joy at the end of uncertainty. For years they had feared civil war, feared invasion, feared the chaos of a throne without an heir. Now, a king had come, young, learned, promising peace. Did Margaret's shade smile to see her dream realized? Did she whisper to herself that the years of chains and loss had been worth it? We cannot know, but we can imagine. For in that moment, her presence was as real as the echo of bells ringing across the city. And yet, her life also leaves us with questions. Was she a mother who loved too fiercely, or a schemer who used her children as pawns? Was he a victim of Henry VIII's tyranny, of Elizabeth's suspicion, or of her own unyielding ambition? Was she a woman undone by her era's cruelty toward women of power, or did she embrace the game too willingly, knowing the cost? The truth lies somewhere between, as it so often does. Margaret was a woman of contradictions, and in those contradictions lies her strength. She was tender and ruthless, faithful and ambitious, obedient and rebellious. She was, above all, human, and in that humanity, she carved a place for herself in the annals of history. Her tomb remains in Westminster Abbey, a quiet monument among the grand effigies of kings and queens. Tourists pass by it, scarcely noticing, drawn instead to the glitter of Henry VII's chapel or the majesty of Elizabeth's resting place. But those who pause to read her name may feel a shiver of recognition. For here lies the woman who shaped the fate of nations, not by sword or crown, but by sheer endurance. Here lies the woman who, though she lived in chains, gave birth to unity. Here lies Margaret Douglas, the woman between two thrones. Her story is a reminder that crowns are not only won on battlefields, but also in the chambers of women who bear children, in the whispers of prisoners who refuse to surrender, in the hearts of those who carry ambition like a secret fire. Margaret's fire burned through loss, through betrayal, through death itself, and though it consumed much, it also lit the path for her grandson. The union of the crowns was not merely a political event. It was the fulfillment of a dream carried by a woman who never stopped believing in the power of her own blood. And so, in the end, her life closes like a candle guttering in the dark, its light fading, but its flame passed on to another wick. James carried that flame across the border, into Westminster, onto the throne of England. He carried with him not only his own hopes, but the hopes of a grandmother who had endured more than most could imagine. In his coronation, her story found its resolution, and though she was gone, her legacy lived, proving at last that Margaret Douglas had never been merely a pawn or a prisoner. She had been, in truth, a queen without a crown, a mother of dynasties, a woman who shaped history from the shadows. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.